Do you eat or drink in your studio? Do you use odorless thinner without ventilation? Or maybe your studio is a disaster zone. These habits are often overlooked, but they can have serious consequences. Consider this passage from this book. Accidental ingestions occur when people pour chemicals into paper cups or glasses and later mistake them for beverages. Some of these accidents have even killed children who are allowed into the studio. And this quote from another book, Health Hazards Manual for Artists. To paraphrase it, he's saying that artists are using the same chemicals as industry, and industrial workers were developing diseases due to the exposure to these chemicals. And the problem is that artists use these chemicals at home and they're not even aware that they're dangerous or they don't take the right precautions. The authors of this book also say that long-term exposure to solvents can cause brain damage and other issues. I also noticed at the end of the Bob Ross documentary that his friends speculated that his illness may have been caused by his use of solvents. The point of this video isn't to cause fear or to discourage you from painting. To the contrary, it's to prove to you that painting can be very safe as long as you implement some basic common sense habits. And these habits don't have to interfere with your painting techniques. In fact, solvent-free oil painting can be as safe, if not safer, than painting with acrylics. I'll talk more about that later in the video. I relied on these two books for most of the information in this video. So this is based on research. One of the authors is a PhD, and Monona Russell is a consultant for health and safety in the arts. I highly recommend picking both of these books up. I have to make it clear that I'm just an artist, and if you have any medical concerns, you have to talk to a medical professional. I'm also not a hazardous materials consultant. This video isn't meant to be professional advice. If you do have such questions, you need to consult professionals. So the first tip is don't eat, drink, or smoke in your studio. I know it's tempting to have a beverage like tea or something while you're working, but eating and drinking in your studio can lead to accidental ingestion. There are two basic ways you can accidentally ingest toxic substances. The first one is that you might be using food containers to store your wastewater or solvents. And that can lead to you or people visiting your studio mistaking them as a beverage and taking a sip from them. You can avoid this by storing solvents or wastewater in a properly labeled container. You want to avoid storing solvents or wastewater in food containers such as yogurt containers, jars, and things that look like glasses. Another issue with using food containers is a lack of labeling. So you'll end up with a bunch of containers with unknown contents. One related tip that I learned from my 8th grade science teacher was never identify a substance by holding it up to your nose and smelling it. I worked in the printing industry for over 24 years, and there's more than one story where someone found a coworker passed out on the floor because they tried to identify a substance by smelling it. If it's ammonia, it'll knock you right out. So you can avoid all that just by labeling your containers. Clearly, labeling your containers should prevent accidents like that. One way that you can accidentally drink your wastewater is if you take a coffee mug and place it next to your wastewater. And then when you get into the zone when you're painting, you grab onto what you think is your coffee mug, but it's actually your wastewater jar. And you take a swig or two before you realize it's paint water. I've seen more than one post from artists on social media where they tell stories where they had this happen to them. The way to eliminate this risk is just to avoid drinking and eating in your studio. Whenever I feel like having a snack or if I want a beverage, I use that as an excuse to get away from the easel and go take a break. That way I could sit down, stare out the window, and enjoy what I'm eating. When I'm painting, I just focus on the painting and I don't mix it with eating. For water media, I recommend using a dedicated container like this. If you do grab onto this, you'll recognize right away that this is not a glass. For one, it's square, but it's also big and bulky. I also use this Masterson rinse well, and there's no way you would pick this up and drink from it. But you do have to be careful though if you have pets. You don't want to leave this unattended. When you're done, remove the water and drain it. And you should drain this too. Pets are a whole different topic. You definitely want to pet-proof your studio. You don't want to leave pallets of wet paint out because cats like to jump up on the tables, and if you have your pallet out there, they might step in your paint. Not only is that a mess, but they could drag it around the house. They might lick it off their paws or whatever. So just be careful if you have pets. The other source of accidental ingestion is through contamination. Here's a quote about eating in the studio. Dust, after all, settles in coffee cups. Vapors can be absorbed by sandwiches. And hands can transfer substances to food and cigarettes. That's another subject of smoking. Smoking is especially hazardous because some substances inhaled through cigarettes can be converted by heat to more hazardous forms. So if you smoke, you want to wash your hands before taking a smoke break because you don't want to transfer paint and other materials to the cigarette. Aside from not eating and drinking in the studio, good hygiene is another subject that I'll talk about later, which can help prevent a lot of accidental ingestions. Just because you can't smell something doesn't mean it's not toxic. Odorless thinner may require ventilation. Here's a quote regarding odor and toxicity. Never assume that failure to detect an odor in a product means that nothing volatile is present. For example, terpenoid is an odorless thinner, and if you look at the safety data sheets, it says use with adequate ventilation, and it's also combustible. When a product says use with adequate ventilation, that begs the question, how much ventilation is adequate? Can you just open a window and assume that's fine? I looked that up, and this book says adequate ventilation really means something toxic gets airborne during use. You need to know what it is, how toxic it is, and how much ventilation you will need for the amount of the substance you use. You should refer to materials safety data sheets, and you may need professional advice. Ventilation systems can be complicated and expensive. Gamblin is another popular odorless thinner, and they state that the ventilation found in homes and schools should be sufficient. They said that they assume that the air is changing over 10 times per hour. I live in a cold climate, and in the winter, I know the air isn't changing over 10 times per hour. The only source for fresh air is the leaks in the windows and the doors, or when you come and go and you open the door. There's no heat exchanger that brings in fresh air. When it's 10 degrees out and storming outside, opening a window is not an option. And the cold weather lasts almost like half the year, so painting with solvents is out of the question for me at home. That leads me to my next tip, and that is to eliminate solvents as much as possible. There are ways to paint with oils without using solvent. The most basic one is to use something like mineral oil to clean your brushes. And then you can follow that up by cleaning it with soap and water. And that does work to clean your brushes. The problem I found with that though is how do you thin the paint? For example, if you want to put a wash down as the first layer, you can't thin it down with oil because that violates the fat over lean principle. The fat over lean principle could be an entire separate video, but the idea is you want the first layers to dry faster than the top layers. So the solution that I found to that is to use water mixable oils. You can use water as your solvent. You can thin out the paint, and the first layer can be as thin as watercolors if you want to. And the cleanup is super simple too. Just regular soap and water will clean out your brushes. Now, some people say that they absolutely hate water mixable oils, and I really don't understand that because it's exactly the same as regular traditional oil paint, except it has an emulsifier in there that lets you clean it up with soap and water. Many brands of oil paints don't even have solvents in them, so it's just pigments mixed with linseed oil. And that's true with water mixable oils. Linseed oil is basically a vegetable oil that's made from flax seeds. So the flax oil by itself is non-toxic. Although some linseed oils have dryers in there and they're definitely not food grade. As I said in the beginning of the video, oils can actually be safer than acrylics because acrylics often contain ammonia or small amounts of formaldehyde. Water mixable oils are just linseed oil and pigment. Some people use oil paints without solvents and clean brushes and skin with baby oil, followed by soap and water. This is a very safe way to work and requires no special ventilation. I mentioned practicing good hygiene in the beginning of the video, and here are a few ways that you can improve your hygiene as an artist. Wear separate clothes for when you paint, and then remove them before you leave the studio. That way you're not dragging charcoal or oil paint throughout your household. You can also wear protective clothing like an apron or an old shirt that you leave in your studio. You want to wash your hands before eating, smoking, or drinking, and when you're done working for the day. You want to pay close attention to getting under your nails and the rough areas around your nails because paint likes to get trapped in those areas. You might want to consider wearing gloves when you paint. People often ask me why I wear gloves in some of my videos, and it's because when I scrub paint off my hands every day, my skin eventually gets chapped. And when your skin dries out, it actually catches more paint and it makes it harder to remove the paint from your skin. So I decided to try wearing gloves to see if I can prevent that from happening, especially in the wintertime. And what I found is that I find it much more convenient. I used to paint for an hour before work every day. I'd wake up early and paint before breakfast. And I found that I really liked the convenience of being able to put my brushes down, peel the gloves off, and move on with my day. I didn't have to sit there and scrub the paint out from underneath my nails. It doesn't seem like a big deal to have some paint on your hands, like under your fingernails, but you have to factor in that if you're painting for decades throughout your life, you'll be ingesting small amounts of pigments throughout your whole lifetime. If you just watch people eat, you'll notice that they lick their hands or they put their finger in their mouth to get food out of it. You won't admit to it, but just watch people. They lick their fingers, and you also prepare foods with your bare hands. I like to make pizza dough, and if you have paint on your nails or there's a little bit left in your fingerprints, you're working the dough and it gets in there. So if you handle food and you have paint on your hands, you'll be getting small bits of that into your food and you're ingesting that over the course of your lifetime. If you wear gloves, you can pretty much eliminate that problem or keep it down to a bare minimum. One mistake that I see some oil painters make is they wear latex gloves, and latex gloves won't hold up to the linseed oil. You can look up the gloves that OSHA recommends on their website. They list all the solvents and which gloves work the best for those solvents. These are the gloves that I use. They're nitrile and vinyl. The nitrile gloves are my favorite because they fit just right, but the fingertips have like a fine texture to them. So when you grab onto a paintbrush, you feel like you have a good grip on it. The vinyl gloves are a little bit bigger. And what I like about them is that they have a little bit of extra room in there. So if I want to take them off so I can handle something with my bare hands, I can do that. I recommend going a size larger for both of these. I would say my hands are a medium, but I bought the large and they seem to fit just right. Another thing to consider too is go a size larger if you work in a hot environment, because I've worked outside when it was like 90 degrees out and my gloves wouldn't really fit. You want to avoid latex because there's all kinds of allergies. Latex can contain up to 50 different proteins that cause allergies. And latex allergies are really serious, so just avoid using them. So the number one tip in this book is to practice good housekeeping. That's the number one cause of like accidents in studios, is just keeping everything in disarray and having too much stuff in your space. This book actually made me reconsider my working space, because not only do I have a lot of art supplies, I have all this different filming gear and lights and things like that that can get into the way. That's one of the reasons why I started working in this space, because I just need more room for all my equipment. You might want to consider getting a storage rack with bins. That way you can put all your art supplies into separate bins and label them. Having a good storage system will help keep the clutter down, and you can make the use of your space. The one that I bought actually bolts into the wall so it won't tip over. Another thing is you don't want to store stuff up high, because if you have to step up on a step stool, that increases the risk that you can fall down. And if you do store stuff up high, use a proper ladder when you want to reach it. And the final thing that I'll talk about is ergonomics. I'll just keep this brief. One common issue I see with artists is they work on a flat surface. And what that means is you'll be looking down while you're working. The human head weighs between 10 and 12 pounds. So that puts a lot of pressure on your neck and your back muscle. So here's an example of me looking down at a desk. Now imagine working that way for 2 or 3 hours at a time with your head tilting downward. It's a lot of pressure on the back of your neck. And the further you move your head down, the more leverage it has on your spine. Now compare that to how I'm sitting at this easel. I could sit upright and look straight ahead at my subject. I don't have to tilt my head down, and my shoulders aren't slumped forward either. So I can hold this position much longer than when I'm sitting at a desk and looking down for hours at a time. This is an easel I'm testing out from Craft Geek. It weighs under 5 pounds and is pretty compact. If you like to stand and paint, you might want to consider getting an anti-fatigue mat. I'm standing on concrete floors, so the extra padding does help. When I'm painting, I often reach for a tool or I'm shifting my weight around, and you can tell the difference with the padding. I've had jobs where I had to stand all day, and I've had jobs where I had to sit all day. Both of those are fatiguing in different ways, but I find if I alternate between standing and sitting, that does help to reduce my fatigue. Up next, you could check out my water mixable oils playlist to see if they might work for you. Please subscribe and like this video if you found it useful. Thanks for watching.